Hello and welcome to Darker Days Radio, Darkling number 29. The Darker Days Radio Darklings are a series of sister shows which we take the time to explore either specific topics with regard to the games of that set in the World of Darkness, or we look at other games that are not produced by White Wolf, CCP, or Onyx Path Publishing, and these games happen to share similar themes and concepts which we believe that our listeners would appreciate. So, Darkling number 29 is, and I will introduce Steve again, who has been part of this series. So, Steve, Darkling 29, what's it about?
Okay, well, hi Chris. I'd like to welcome you to episode 5 of the Darker Days series about the Dark Ages world. Now, this is a series that me and Adrian had kicked off with. Now, unfortunately, due to some personal issues, Adrian's looking into doing his PhD next year, I understand. He's taken a step back, and I'm going to be co-hosting this episode with Darker Days' own man of science, Chris.
Excellent. Yes, I can totally sympathise with Adrian's position, so it's a shame to see him go, but we will continue on with what he and yourself have started, which has been great so far.
Okay, Chris. Well, perhaps you can tell us something about your past gaming history with Dark Ages Vampire or Vampire the Dark Ages.
Okay, so let's see. Vampire the Dark Ages is what I've played, and I got into playing it through a friend of a friend at university. So I got introduced to their gaming group. Realised basically they were just a similar collection of goth geek gamers, and got invited to play Vampire the Dark Ages. And we basically played through, I would say, the first 5 or 6 supplements that in the series for Vampire the Dark Ages. So that includes Clash of Wills, Bitter Crusade, Under the Black Cross, Fountains of Bright Crimson, Constantinople by Night, Jerusalem by Night, and my character for that series was let me get this right, a French Malkavian noble known as Gregoire de Morangias. So de Morangias being a noble house which features in the film Brotherhood of the Wolf, so that's where the inspiration for his name came from. It was basically a writer and musician, so he was kind of like the bard of the group, but eventually kind of evolved to the point where he was a member of the Church of Cain. He would write sigils that would drive people mad. And, he would bite his own wrist and then spit up the blood and start reading the future from it, as well as sometimes magnificently failing at being stealthy, and then sometimes succeeding at the most ridiculous things at being stealthy. Yeah, that was about it, really.
So it's fair to say you have a wide history with this game line.
Yeah, I mean, we had a Cappadocian in the group, we had a Viking Gangrel in the group, we had a Ventru Greek, Constantinople Knight. I think there was what's the offshoot of the Gangrel who were all Celtic style? That's the Fianna? No, I can't remember the name.
No, that's a werewolf tribe.
That's a werewolf tribe. Yeah, it's Anyway, so yeah, there was quite a diverse selection of characters in there as well, and I think eventually, like, my character and the Greek Ventru ended up owning some land in the Veneto, and so our characters were like, whenever for the downtime years between parts of the Chronicle, it was assumed that our characters just buggered off back to Venice, and just had fun.
Okay, cool. So tonight we're going to be talking about how to run a game of Dark Ages for your group, and basically trying to help storytellers trying to get groups off the ground, or existing storytellers tell something that's a bit more in theme of what they want to portray to their group. Now, both Adrian and you yourself have spoken in the past about playing quite long-winded games where you play over quite a long period of time. And this poses the kind of first question about preparing your group for your story, where you want to tell a vast, sweeping narrative, or do you want to come at things and say, okay, then, well, I'm going to come to you with maybe 1 or 2 night kind of flashback in an existing, say, Vampire the Masquerade kind of chronicle. Chris, you've obviously played this game over a kind of a sweeping campaign. What would you say that the benefits of doing that are in this setting?
It's really difficult. I think the benefit is obviously, the Dark Ages and that period of time. There is quite a vast difference between different parts of the world. So, whereas in modern nights, you could almost say we live in a monoculture, almost to a certain extent. There's a McDonald's on every street corner, whether you're in like somewhere in Italy or somewhere in Tokyo or then somewhere in America.
Yeah.
Whereas the Dark Ages, you don't have that. The only thing that's close to being a monoculture is the fact that the church is there. And that's the unifying thing. And everything else can be quite vastly different. I mean, you could have a setting where you've taken the United Kingdom, which wouldn't be the United Kingdom. And, it's very, I would say it's a less advanced part of that world. Whereas if you compare that to, say, Venice at that time was pretty much, a cultural, scientific, economic powerhouse. And then if you want to look at somewhere completely different, you could look at Lithuania. I think it's Lithuania, during the Dark Ages, was one of the last pagan kingdoms. And so they openly had worship to pagan gods. And that again strikes such a contrast to what is largely a bunch of Christian kingdoms. So there's a lot there you can play with. But that can make it very difficult, because if you could go with the kitchen sink approach and let your characters wander far and wide, which is kind of like the game I was participating in. Our coterie was known as the Itinerant Company, because we really couldn't think of another name to call them. But then, if you really want to and that may require a lot of work, because obviously you want to research a little bit about each place they're visiting and kind of, highlight what's interesting about those places. Or you could go and focus on just one city or one country and look at the very specifics of living there. So I would say, based upon what I've read and written for my own Changeling games, I could take that work and go, right, I'm going to run Vampire the Dark Ages Venice. And to me, it'd be a no-brainer.
Well, one of the things that I was thinking about this week before we were recording this podcast is pitching the idea to your group before you begin and being upfront with them about what you want to do. This idea that, your players are going to have to spend a lot of real-world time investing in your game, and to come to them and say, I want to play something that's quite epic, and say you take the modules that you talked about in your introduction.
Yeah.
There are several modules there that, if you were to play them back to back, would be several gaming sessions.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So without much work, storytellers can put out to a group quite a long-winded thing by just merely picking up the PDFs that are available from Drive-Thru RPG of the Dark Ages lines, and you've had some experience with this, but basically pitching them to the group. Have you ever played with Vampire the Dark Ages, or Dark Ages Vampire, flashbacks in games?
No, but it's something I'm toying with for my own Requiem game, is doing a flashback at some point, but that's more of kind of a way of featuring how different eras are. But I would say doing a flashback is really quite feasible, because then you don't have to invest too much work in maybe experimenting with the setting.
Mm. Mm. Well, my experience with flashbacks in the game, especially for interesting 1 or 2 night stands, to give your players a kind of break from long-winded characters or long-standing characters. I mean, even the most up-for-it player can lose their enthusiasm for your game at some point.
Yeah.
And so spicing your chronicle up with the ability to play somebody else for a bit. And perhaps buying into they talked about in the old World of Darkness, a troop style play where characters would make characters for their ghouls and other related people, to give them a much more of a soap opera kind of feel. Now, I think that works great for long-winded campaigns, but for a short one-night stand, that's not going to work so well for you, is it?
I think it'd be kind of cool. This is my idea. Is like you could do the flashbacks where you could play as your character's kind of like grandsire, or simply you can look at your own current, say, modern night setting, and if you work out which characters might have been in that area or related to those characters, the NPCs of your setting, and either themselves or other related characters that were in that place in nights gone by, and then have your players play as those NPCs, because they suddenly get a bit more investment in the characters that they're interacting with in your setting, and it just makes the setting deeper, and that requires though your players to kind of to buy into the thing of like, you are going to be playing as one of the NPCs in our game, but this is just so that you can experience the game and the setting in a way that you would not normally have access to.
Very much so. Something that I'm toying with in my current V20 game, the group wants to have a look at the darker side of the modern setting and play Sabbat vampires. Now, my big kind of figurehead vampire, I'm going to use a Shimizi called Verghast, which has been the kind of a big bad in my current Pittsburgh campaign.
Okay.
And use a flashback for this character to show how inhuman they are by starting off and showing the mortal Verghast as being a woman, rather than as being betrayed by the current characters being a man, much the same way that Mika and Sasha Vikos, if you remember those. That's to reinforce the inhumanity of that character and show how over, say, 1,000 years of existence, it has become something more than human. And that's something that I really want to get across to my group, and look at elders, perhaps when they were much more reckless and acting more like the group were, and then see them 1,000 years in the future if they survive, and show how it's made them so cautious and buy into the jihad, even if they are in the Sabbat or the Camarilla.
I think other ways you can do things is obviously if you want to just test the waters with your players playing in the Dark Ages, is have some pre-generated characters. Again, the idea that you kind of like cover most of the archetypes. You put the dots there. You put enough background to make the character playable, and that the group of characters that you make for your players is playable. But also you leave enough creative license for your players to have to really get into the character and play it the way they want to for that one shot. And that works for any one shot. Yeah. I mean, it can be something really as simple as what could you do? Oh no, there's a really good story you could do. One of the stories we did in the game I played, our characters went to a carnival that had set up shop outside some village, and there were like rumours of people going missing. So obviously our characters were invested with trying to find out why, because this is really bad. We don't want humans to realise there's vampires and start killing us. And you can really get into like the kind of like the old school, the folklore of the time. You can highlight that and the difference of morality with how they would have treated like the freaks and weirdos of the time, and you can really get then also into like how a carnival is really fun, because then you can look at like pagan folklore and how that gets hidden in amongst all the Christian lore, and how that's presented. And it's you can do something very simple as investigation like that, and eventually finding out that the killer is some nefarious vampire with some other ulterior motive. But it's something nice and compact, and really gets across the atmosphere of the setting without having to have lots and lots of politics and needing to know the ins and outs of like the setting of that time.
Whereas perhaps it's your responsibility as a storyteller to slowly introduce all that backdrop as the game goes on to educate your players, because that leads on to my next kind of question, is basically how would you approach Dark Ages with a group that have never played World of Darkness before? Perhaps people who are based out of a D&D background, or perhaps if you're from the UK and you're big into Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, which I know is massive over there at the minute. How would you do that? Are you going to approach it with it's D&D with fangs, or are you going to say, well, no, I'm going to perhaps start it like that, but then educate you as we go along?
That's difficult. I mean, to say it was D&D with fangs, I don't think is quite. Yeah, it's obviously not the way I would approach it. I would say, I would actually reference a particular film, so like Kingdom of Heaven or Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, if you want to go with something just to kind of get the atmosphere right and go, right, imagine that, and that in the shadows there are the vampires manipulating people, manipulating the church, and they don't want to be found out because they're quite happy being the lords of the night that they are, and you're those vampires. I think that's enough. I think to reference another game and say, but with fangs or something, I think sets up the wrong sort of expectation.
I couldn't agree with you more.
Except for maybe Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, because Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay has an advantage in that it's an extrapolation of Renaissance times. At least the Empire is in that game, and it's very Renaissance Germanic. And I think you could basically go, take the Empire, remove all the craziness of every other supernatural race there, and Chaos Gods and all that type of stuff, and leave the gritty harshness of that setting. And everyone will be like, okay, yeah. Then add back in vampires, but they're like this, rather than the vampires already in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. And I think you can make that's a justified comparison.
Well, I'm glad that you brought up Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, because that's one of the kind of movies that I wanted to talk about during this kind of storyteller advice section. It is perhaps an imagination of what the Dark Ages world was like, perhaps thinking from a 20th century point of view. Now, remember that your players are always going to be coming at all problems from a modern understanding of at least the rudiments in science, geography, world history. In the Dark Ages world, your NPCs or your PCs really shouldn't be acting like this. But does it really matter? Because sometimes, perhaps telling a story that's perhaps fun-driven rather than history-driven, which is something we talked about just before the podcast, isn't it, Chris? That this idea of pitching a game to your players that it's kind of the medieval world, but if you start hitting books, you're going to be starting poking holes in what I'm saying. But let's not really look at the history as being, let's all go out and get a doctorate and become world-renowned authorities on this subject, because let's face it, we're doing it for fun.
Yeah,
if your group wants to do that, great. I know that you're a big advocate of really hitting the books hard and teasing out all the historical madness, but that's a lot of work, wouldn't you agree?
It is a lot of work. I think if you've got the storyteller that's willing to put in the work to begin with to research the setting that they're doing, and like my storyteller for Dark Ages was that type of storyteller, as in he had the books, and we were looking at historical maps of the time, and and also I'd been then to Venice, I think as well partway through that game, and so obviously brought back a certain kind of view of the setting for that. And I think if you want the historical accuracy, but you don't want to tread on anyone's toes, because obviously the GM, the storyteller at the end, is trying to tell a story, and you don't want to have like, oh well, that's historically incorrect. Get on with the game, get on with the fun, but that shouldn't stop if players want to get involved in going, well, it was actually like this, and it's like, okay, we'll remember that for next time, because you can all collaborate together to ensure that your game is more historically correct if you want that. If it's not important to the details of the actual story, the drama that is being played out, and the drama is the key thing, then just let it fly. Just get on with the game. You can always retcon things. Like, I retcon things in my own write-ups for my own games. If I go, shit, that detail's just completely bollocks, I'll just retcon it and tell the players next week that actually it was like that, you don't mind, nah, let's go on the game.
So yeah, basically I couldn't agree more that going to your group and speaking to them again and pitching your ideas and coming back with a dialogue is exactly what you need to do. And as you said,
I would still say to a degree, players should at least research a little bit about where their characters come from, because certain things will be relevant, like the languages characters speak, and the type of the flavor of religion that they may practice, because the Dark Ages was filled with heretical cults, and there's enough variation between Catholicism at one end of Europe to Catholicism and Christianity at another end, and people may think, oh well, there's Eastern Orthodox and there's Catholics and there's Protestants in the modern Knights. There's many flavors of Christianity, and there were so many schisms that it's kind of sometimes cool worth to go, oh, they would have thought this. That's kind of fun to play, because that just adds a little bit more to the in-game character kind of into character talking that can go on. So, for example, my one friend in the group was playing a Cappadocian, and of course I was playing this Frenchman, and we had, and so whenever there was a quiet point where we weren't involved in the main plot, we would kind of have in-character discussions about philosophy that our characters had, because we shared some of the same things, but then also didn't share some of the other things, but ultimately agreed that we knew better than the rest of the other characters in the coterie. So we were kind of like the bard, and we were the bard and the necromancer talking about philosophy of death and God, whereas we had the barbarian and the pagan and the knight, and going, oh, they're a bunch of fools.
well, that's an interesting segue into the next kind of question I wanted to pitch to you. Is basically managing your player choices. As you said, in your group, you had a wide variety of characters there. I mean, in the Dark Ages, you could quite feasibly have perhaps a player who comes to you and says, I want to play a Tremere, and then somebody else comes to you and say, I want to play a Salubri. And how's that going to go down well in your vast, sweeping epic that you want everybody to go away and do vast amounts of researches with? Now, I know that the last time we did a chronicle design Darkling, we talked about this with Sam and James, didn't we?
Yeah.
That managing your player choices is something that's very much in the hands of the storyteller. But always saying that if your player comes to you with a really good idea, perhaps looking at things in a new light to allow a player perhaps room to grow as a role player is always an interesting idea as well, isn't it?
You've got to sometimes massage these issues a bit. I mean, for Christ's sake, as I said, we had like a pagan vampire in the group, and all the other characters were essentially worshipped God under a particular guise. I mean, obviously you've got a Church Cane person, you've got a Cappadocian, you've got a Ventru from Constantinople, and you've got a Viking. So there were moments when you would have the pagan vampire go off and summon a spirit. I think he summoned a bloody tree spirit or something at some point. And pretty much you just got all the other characters sat around going, what's going on? I mean, from the setting material in the books, it's almost like, if one group sees another one, it's like, death on sight. but because of the way we were playing this itinerant company, the whole point was the itinerant company travelled around because A, it worked for them, and B, well, if they're willing to travel around, they're willing to put up with a few weird things.
Well,
we were essentially the liberals of the time.
Well, but again, that's a very 20th century way of looking at things, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, one thing that instantly sprang to mind when you were describing your coterie then is you were basically saying how you had a Byzantine vampire in a the same coterie as say a French vampire. Now, Eastern Orthodoxy and Western kind of, like you said, Catholicism has some major schisms in their belief in what's going on. So it can lead to some interesting character conversation, like you said. It'd be interesting to be a fly on the wall in some of the philosophical debates there, that if you're exploring those kind of things, that basically that Christianity isn't so much of as a live and let live kind of religion as it is today. Back in, so like you were saying about the Canaanite heresy, there are also other heresies that are merely mortal heresies, like Gnosticism and things like this, that were kind of stamped out by the church.
Yeah, Bogomils and Cathars, and there's a lot.
So again, even your players' choice of characters' religion or how they view God is an interesting thing that needs to be thought of at this time, because there's, in the Dark Ages, a whole host of new questions that really need to be thought of. Perhaps in a modern game, thinking of things like how computer savvy your character is a big deal. Say in the Dark Ages setting, basically having linguistics 1 Latin may be one of the most beneficial things that your character has.
I think pretty much every single vampire in Vampire the Dark Ages knows Latin to an extent so they can speak to everyone else. So another thing to do with character choices and things that would make gameplay for the group interesting, of course, is also ethnic groups at the time, because obviously, again, it's not quite a monoculture yet. So, there's very different choices to play, and it's just a case of carefully massaging all these things together to make a player group that works.
Well, this is one of the things that I wanted to bring up, that in the bookend of the first Dark Ages podcast that we put out, you and Mike were talking about Vampire the Dark Ages and talking about some of the supplements that were released for that seemed a bit weird. Things like Walls of the Sea and Winds from the East and things like this. Now, it may seem like they're very whimsical choices, but when you think about it from perhaps a historical point of view, that looking at cultural groups like the Vikings or the Mongols. Remember, the Mongols pushed all the way as far as Poland and Hungary, and things like especially in say the British Isles. As you know yourself, you're from the UK. That Viking influence here is massive.
Yes,
there was an entire Viking kingdom in the UK, wasn't there? Based out of York, wasn't it? Jorvik, I believe it was called.
Yeah, well, there's the Jorvik Centre, yeah.
Yeah. So perhaps if you're going to set something in the UK that's quite interesting like that, that's perhaps you look at the Saxon vampires and the Nordic vampires. That's perhaps the Saxon Ventru and the Gangrel Nordics, which is, I know, very stereotypical, but that book lends you a lot of wealth of information to flesh out those Gangrels, to make them seem more real. Culturally, rather than okay, well, they're Vikings, so they've all got horn helmets, they get drunk every night, and they rape and pillage. Yay!
Well, actually, you can be quite diverse as well. I don't know whether you saw this on the news as well. I think it was in York that they actually have evidence of archaeological evidence of from the Roman times of black, African descent people living there who weren't And everyone goes, oh, well, they must have been there. And this is Roman times, okay? So York also was a Roman city. And, people's, when you say that, some people, and this came up in conversation, like when I was on a conference, some American guy, I hate to say Americans, but this was just something I had to slap down. He goes, well, obviously they were the slaves of the Romans. It's like, actually, no. This just shows how, you can actually have quite a lot, you can still, even in these historical times, have quite a lot of cultural diversity. And, what we may have thought about why different ethnic groups were where they were, or when you see them, is not actually due to some of these kind of quite actually relatively modern ideas about slavery and everything. Because the slavery type thing is more of a Tudor thing. So you can equally
I know what you're saying.
You can basically be quite there's quite a lot of room to have quite a lot of ethnic diversity with your characters, and even gender diversity with your characters. And if you shouldn't feel like for what you want to play and to have a good story, that history as it's been written or history as it's been misconstrued should limit you on how you want to play the game.
Definitely not. I couldn't agree more with that. But also, as you were saying, like looking at things from a wider perspective, that just because there's no historical evidence to say that somebody from Africa didn't travel all the way to London is preposterous, because it's not like those worlds are so wildly disconnected, like, say, Native Americans.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that would be a massive leap of faith for me. But someone, say, from North Africa, travelling all the way, say, through Spain, then France, then into England, up into Pictic kind of Scotland, and then into Norway. Why not?
The Romans did it quite happily.
Yeah, exactly. And that's another thing that I think I wanted to talk about, perhaps on a general basis, just for storytellers, is don't forget that just because you're playing in the Dark Ages, people are not stupid. They may be illiterate, but they are wise in the ways of the world. And something that we were talking about just before we were recording, wasn't it, Chris? About the very kind of nature of things, like, say, like Exalted, which is a high fantasy setting. You still need basic skills like hunting or foraging to get by, because it's not like you can just pop down to your local 7-Eleven or Sainsbury's and pick up your groceries and your milk, because even if you're a vampire, you've got obviously some connection with the world, be it your ghouls need to feed or your herd is in need of feeding. These are very real ideas that things from a 20th century point of view need to be kind of left behind, if you can buy into that perception. And allowing your players to do that is something that's hard to get across for a storyteller. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think it's like it's worth reinforcing these points in a game, just so that the players realise, in some respects, how much harder their life is, but also how much easier, because vampires can literally get away with murder in the Dark Ages setting far easier than they can in a modern day setting. There's no such thing as, forensic sciences is pretty much non-existent. It's whoever's got the dagger with the blood on it is obviously the killer.
Yes, but then in the Dark Ages,
you
can also argue the toss that perhaps that if that ire is then raised, if you are unfortunate enough to get caught with a bloody dagger, normally society is quite happy for brutal things to happen to you quite quickly and be done with it. So if they decide that you are a vampire because there's some mortal preaching from the pulpit that you're the evil lord on the manor, you're somehow cursed and all the rest of this kind of business, that once they turn up with the pitchforks and the blazing torches, they're not going to be very understanding and saying, hey, explaining things away with science, because these are people of mythology, people that buy into the idea that out in the wilderness there are things like fae, werewolves, vampires. These are very real things.
It's actually quite interesting that you bring this up because when you say that people can be quick to anger and quick to being shown, oh, he's obviously a monster, and quick to go to these conclusions, it actually shows you how in the Dark Ages setting, many of the disciplines available, many of the powers available to a vampire are actually really critical to survival, because you don't have the 20th century cultural culture and morals and infrastructure to defend yourself. So, like, normally, if you're a vampire and you've killed someone and you've not had time to clear up your evidence, you can make use of, well, I'll bribe him, and I'll get into the morgue and I'll deal with it, or I know someone that has access to the files, and we'll do that, or I know someone that I can like hack into the computers and do that. You can make use of the mortal world to clear up your mess quite easily, and you wouldn't even need to turn to many of your powers to do that. Whereas if a bunch of mortals get together and want to pick up their pitchforks and have their flaming torches and going after you, you can't really fall back on the police or anything else for that kind of support. You actually go, shit, I think I'm going to have to use majesty here. And so, if anything, disciplines are more important.
Yeah, definitely. One thing that you guys, you and Mike did that was very interesting a while back on the Darker Day show is talk about ashen cults.
Okay, yeah.
Building yourself up as a cult where you present yourself, especially if you buy into this Cainite heresy idea. Now, and one thing I wanted to also just talk about in this storyteller advice section is perhaps taking misconceptions about the Dark Ages world and turning them slightly on their head and saying, okay, then, well, are all Bali evil? Okay. 99.9999% of them, yes. But perhaps there's just one of them that's wanting to be different. Perhaps. Now, let's say you take somebody that very much believes that they are a Cainite heresist. They believe that they are somehow ordained by God. But then they preach that to people, but then reinforce that with miracles, i.e. the use of disciplines or feeding of vitae. It's and then things like transubstantiation. That idea, that Catholic idea that and when you go for the Eucharist, taking the wine and the little wafer, it literally turns into the blood and the body of Christ. Transubstantiation. But what's to say? Okay, well, no, I'm so holy that there's no need for transubstantiation. It's already blood, and you take this sacrament and buying into this, and mortals buying into this in a bigger way than say in the modern world, that people would be like, whoa, this is a cult. We've read all about this on the internet. I've seen this on 60 Minutes. I know about cults. They're all Scientologists. Blah 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 blah. Yeah. Whereas in the Dark Ages world, people really wouldn't buy into that idea of cults. I don't understand. I don't believe, unless they were really high up in the papacy.
Yeah.
But again, that's another interesting thing, that if you've got somebody in your group that wants to pull in one way, that wants to subvert the mortal world into believing the vampires are great, and then you have somebody else that's perhaps a member of the church and wants to hide and use the church to hide all these things. That's another interesting twist on things, rather than using the church to augment your power.
Yeah.
But this is, again, looking at the Dark Ages world, not through 20th century eyes, because it's very easy, I think, in modern days, that many people that you talk to, when you speak especially about religion, they're not particularly religious. And,
I think I was going to say something interesting on that about religion, and it gives you a kind of interesting reason to look at stuff and gain a perspective on it. Is also, when you look at stuff to do with like Constantinople by night and Jerusalem by night and everything, historically speaking, Islam at that time is very young. It's technically a very young religion. Many of the Muhammad and his own followers and own children that go on to create many of the different sects of that form Islam, are actually, historical figures, as in they've only died in the last, 100 years, 200 years, or maybe even still alive, and it makes it it would make those type of characters really interesting to play, just because their religion is so new to the world.
Well, again, that's something else I wanted to talk about. That now both Mike and Adrian have talked about podcasts that are available out there that are historical kind of based. Like Mike talked about the 12 Byzantine emperors,
Yeah,
and Adrian turned me on to a Yale University kind of lecture about the Middle Ages, which is really what we're talking about, guys. The Dark Ages, historically, there is no Dark Ages. It's really what we're talking about is the Middle Ages. Now, these are two podcasts about this era that basically spans about 1,000 years. Now, that was a bit of an awakening to me, because I always thought the Dark Ages was, about 500 or 600 years of European history that went from A to B, and you realise that no, it's not just that. It's much more about the fall of Rome, the rise of Constantinople, the fall of Constantinople, and like I say, the burgeoning of new religions like Islam. But the game line sometimes leads you into an idea that it's 1260 and this is the world. Well, you could actually take that world and put it at any time, as long as you're willing to do a little bit of background reading. Like you say, if you want the Islam to rise a bit quicker, there's nothing wrong with that. As long as your group's happy with that, which ties back into the idea of mutating history and looking at a wider scope, that things like Rome, the Greek kind of world, the Persian world, still having an influence on this world. That, like we were talking about before, people being able to talk Latin and Greek straight off the bat is universal languages, far more so than any local dialect, like say perhaps Saxon.
Well, yeah, because I was going to say in France they had at least about 3 or 4 different languages there. The same with Spain. You can't just say everyone speaks Spanish. There's Spanish, and then there's Catalonian. So
yeah, but from an Arabic point of view, being able to speak Arabic, literally is the unifying thing for them, in the same way that Latin is the unifying thing of the Christian Church. So again, being able to understand this new thing, and like you were saying about the cultural differences, that remember that Muslims at this time, or the Arabian world, are, shall we say, more advanced scientifically than the Christian counterparts.
Oh yeah, yeah.
They have a wider understanding of what we would consider modern mathematics, things like modern medicine and things like this, that are merely, they're hundreds of years away in the Christian world, that allow you to bring cultural differences that are quite amazing. That your players can run through. Now, one thing that one of my players did back in the day is look at his Assamite character and wanted to move away from the idea that he was just basically a dervish, or this idea of he's a Moor that's out there and basically chopping off heads with a Saracen sword and diabolizing everyone. Now, again, he looked at movies like Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. If you remember Samuel L. Jackson's character in that, he's very different to the Christians there, but manages to form a kind of easy peace with them and show them things like, if you remember, there's a scene with Kevin Costner and Morgan Freeman. Sorry, yes. Whoa, that's a big mistake there. Whoa, yeah, anybody can call me up on that. Sorry.
No, it's cool. It's totally cool. I just had a silly, just sort of like Samuel Jackson going off on some foul-mouthed diatribe against the Sheriff of Nottingham. Anyway, Morgan Freeman, because his character was, you could almost say, was a warrior, but was also kind of more like, he also had knowledge of what would it? He was a solid chemist. He was an alchemist. I mean, that's where the word alchemy comes from. It's an Arabic term.
Exactly. Now, this idea that in that same movie, he pulls out what is basically a telescope.
Yeah.
And looks, and then hands it to Kevin Costner, and Kevin Costner's like, "Whoa!" Draws his sword and starts swinging around. That's a very interesting
far
idea.
Away.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But then, But then this is a very kind of way of looking at things. Also, in say that movie, Kingdom of Heaven, towards the end in the battle for Jerusalem, they go out and they mark out things and paint white rocks for the range of their catapults. That guy's a blacksmith. Now, really, would he have a lot of understanding of those things? I don't think so. But from a 20th century point of view, that makes for a very interesting part of the movie that your players can still do and base it in some kind of idea that, hey, I'm an Assamite and I'd understand things like trigonometry and ranges and things like that far more than any of these other Christian dudes. So me going out and doing all these things would seem weird. Bits of knotted rope and calculating things in strange Arabic numbers that weren't like the Latin numerals that you'd be using. Yeah, you'd be like, what the hell is this?
I mean, that actually makes for a really interesting, Assamite assassin. Is one that's just a full-on kind of scientist assassin who's just yes, these people are dead, but it's because I've used the power of science, which we've rescued from Rome because all you crazy Catholics have just let all that knowledge disappear.
Yeah, exactly. And you say that we're the closed-minded ones. We're the ones who are unopen to new ideas. Okay. But then again, that's looking at what kind of pitch you want to come to your players, which is, again, part of the preparing your group. Now, we talked about flashbacks in Dark Ages and the uses of them, but also what we're looking at here is parallel stories. Now, have you ever run anything where you've run in different systems games that run literally in tandem to perhaps open new vignettes of understanding into characters?
Give me an example and I'll tell you if I have.
Okay, then perhaps say, like in my Sabbat upcoming thing, I want to kick things off for my group for the Shimizi vampire. Verghast, like I talked of, being a woman. Now, I'm going to use a piece of music by a band called Wumpscut.
Okay, yeah.
It's called The Wreath of Barbs.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, I use Reliquary to design an actual Wreath of Barbs that my group has been chasing around in Pittsburgh. Verghast's whole understanding of reason for going to Pittsburgh is to tie into this item. Now, I'm going to kick off the Sabbat game with a remix of that is played on mandolins and is sung by a woman, because I want Verghast to be like this to begin with. And then later on in the same Sabbath thing, I'm going to play in the modern setting the full-on industrial hardcore version that's sung by a man, but is still the same lyrics, the same words, but just different, to reinforce that sense of difference and allow your group to understand why they're so different.
Yeah.
Also in my Pittsburgh campaign, as I spoke about in the chronicle design thing, I had two Elders of War, Faith and Hope. Now, the group as a whole wanted to follow Faith, but not all the group wanted to do this. Some were quite interested in throwing their lot in with Hope. But what I decided to do is, outside of the normal game time on a Saturday night, is run for those who wanted to come along, a kind of spin-off to explore what Hope was doing, to show that, how did they know that we were going to be here? Yeah. That Saturday night, I run something else that then they are then part of the investigation. So they find out because they did it. And it's something that's run in parallel. Have you ever done anything like that?
I haven't done that, but it's something I have and I haven't. So for my vampire setting, I would like to run a game where the characters are mainly auto-Darkle, just to give different perspective to the setting. And so they see key plot points occur from the other side of the mirror, really. And then the other way in which my things have worked in parallel is that I have run. So I've run my vampire setting. I ran so season. What was season 1 of Vampire? I've run twice because I ran it for one gaming group, then I ran it for another, which involved my wife, and now we're on to season 2 finally. But in between the first time I ran it and the rerun, I also got to run the first few stories of my mage setting, and there are plot points which are shared. And so I had one player go, "Oh shit, it's that!" And because he had played in the vampire game, And it was just that moment of like the player going, wow, okay, now I know the setting a bit more, and that's great, but I can now play it, I can play the game knowing that, but also make it more fun because I know that in that, you play with the setting, not against it with that knowledge.
Mm.
And it's really good to do that, yeah, you're right.
Yeah. And I think it's a very interesting way of approaching characters that are perhaps not having a lot of fleshing out, but you still want to be part of your main narrative. So your group gets the gravitas of different parts of the game, so they understand what you're trying to get across to them. Because sometimes, when you write your, let's say for your Venice thing, perhaps, I don't know if you've encountered this, but when I ran for the first time the Chicago Chronicles for the Old World of Darkness, I really wanted to get this idea across that Lodin's brood was kind of at war with each other because there's a new brood and an old brood. Most of my players didn't get it because I'd read the book, they hadn't. I didn't get it across to them in enough sense that they understood what I had by reading the book. Running these different things allows you to do that, then fleshes out that character in a tangential way that gives more depth to the character, and especially when the group can come back and say, especially if there's something like Malkavians or visionary characters, that you do it as a flashbacks part for them, that then reiterate to the group, I've seen this, I've done this. One thing that, again, that the power of faith allows you in the Dark Ages to tap into characters that believe they are essentially very holy, that they have visions that are sent by, I use quote unquote things here, God or saints or different manifestations of whatever faith you decide they're going to follow, to do things that they are being manipulated by, like Methuselah's. Now, you talked a bit before about Constantinople by night. Now, Mikhail the Toreador there sets himself as the Archangel Michael, doesn't he?
Yeah.
And uses his power to reinforce that. Well, what's to say that other Methuselahs aren't doing that and using you and your group as foils, and that you can explore tangential bits and pieces to give depth to your world, which is hard sometimes. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes if you can get the group to work right, you can do that if the players have a certain amount of built-in antagonism. So, okay, using my let me think. My brain's just gone melted. Okay, using my Venice setting, most of the characters in that coterie, in that motley of changelings, were autumn courtiers, and my wife's character was a spring courtier, and most of the autumn courtier players hated a particular NPC, and sometimes it was kind of like I even thought, as just taking a step back, not being the storyteller, was like, why the hell are you hating him? I can't see what he's done other than being a bit too suave and a bit too sure of himself and everything. And so the cool thing was that because Sam was playing this spring courtier, her character would go off and do stuff with the spring court, and it meant everyone could see it from the other side of that character. And her character got on well with this spring courtier, and was like, oh well, and it left everyone going, should we trust him? Shouldn't we? I mean, he's kind of cool, but also he says really horrible stuff to us. But then there's other people that say even worse stuff, and it's nice when you can get your players to be, if your players can work in that way, that they have multiple commitments to different groups, because then you can kind of sample all these different social groups and really get a feel for what they're like. And I think you can do that in Dark Ages just as well. I mean, it's the same sort of stuff, really.
Yeah, agreed. And this is why using insightful bits and pieces from your own experience and my own experiences, allowing us to talk about this. Now, getting back perhaps on track, I'd like to talk to you about, say, the modules that you've run through. Now,
okay.
we had some fan feedback right at the very beginning, and that was from a guy called Mika. Both me and Adrian were very thankful for his feedback, and he was talking about basically the use of modules, or what he could basically pick up and run for a new group. Now, I wrote back to Mika, and the reply I'm going to use for the kind of brief breakdown, very kind of a quick fire, is a look at the different modules. Now, the first one I'm going to look at is the Bitter Crusade.
Okay.
Now, this is basically a story set against the backdrop of the Fourth Crusade. It's set in 3 linked stories: Venetian Nights, Fiendish Winters, and Dying Embers. It takes the players from Venice to Constantinople via Zara with the crusading army. Each of the stories has its own unique feel, and the battle against the Shimmersy Horde, including not 1 but 2 Vods or Vozuds, depending on pronunciation. Now, the Crusades are the thing that every even non-role players can easily imagine. That this idea that knights are traveling from Europe into the Holy Lands to reclaim things. This is something that you can use for, like we said before, players that don't have a basis in the World of Darkness. And there's also a lot of basically big fights in this that you could throw your players, and especially for novice players, give them something to beat up, which is very easy to do in your first kind of things. But it also allows you, because they can't travel to places like Constantinople, to then build upon it. Now, this book also closes a very useful prologue and talks about how to link your chronicle to the Transylvania Chronicles, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Now, what are your experiences with Bitter Crusade?
It's quite great. I mean, each of those 3 stories in there are very different. I will try and remember what I can. So, Venetian Nights is, I think the best way to describe it is a classic political kind of murder mystery that takes place against the backdrop of Venice. And, Venice is critical to the Fourth Crusade. The background to it also being that the current Doge of Venice at that time, I think it's Dandeli, or I can't remember, but he has a grudge to settle with Constantinople. He was blinded in Constantinople and eventually returned to Venice, became Doge, and saw an opportunity to go, yeah, okay, we'll pay the money, here's your ships, we'll take you to Jerusalem for crusade, and it was like, well, we're going to go via Constantinople. And yeah, that's a really great little story. I think especially because you could pad out that area, because Venice is a culturally and historically rich city as it is, that you could really pad out the run up to the formation of this crusading fleet. After all, you've got the Arsenal of Venice, which was at the time essentially, they churned out like 2 ships a week. We're talking like warships a week. That's how good Venice was. Fiendish Winter takes place in Zara and the burning of it, and let me remember bits of the plot. I think there was another group of vampires that were worried about the crusade going off after them. There's some crazy bits with some flesh-crafted creatures in a barn. That was amusing, and it involves the word oyster.
It's quite a lot to do with the like a Shimmersy void, basically laying siege to the group, which is again an interesting idea that you can pitch to new players.
And then Dying Embers, I can't quite remember as well.
That's the kind of introduction into Constantinople, the ending of it that allows you to expand into different bits and pieces. I really liked Bitter Crusade. It's fairly cheap to pick up. If you like, you can then expand it into other bits and pieces. And I think it's a great beginning kind of module that you can introduce to people that aren't used to the Dark Ages setting. Now, another great introduction kind of module is Under a Black Cross, which is again available from Drive-Thru RPG. Set again against the backdrop of the Crusade, this time the 5th one. Again, it's actually 3 linked stories: the Shadow Court, Shadows of Court, Ashes of Outmere, and The Call to Arms. The story takes place from the group from Germany to Hungary to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, working for a Ventru lord looking to stake claims in the land of Hungary, and eventually seeking the true cross in the Holy Land. It's a great storyteller chapter at the back of the book, looking at how to weave more into your story by suggesting several story seeds that can be developed into a larger chronicle. Now, what's your experience with Under a Black Cross?
You'll have to again remind me about certain plot points. So in the first one, it's almost like a gathering of, if I'm remembering, if the Germany, where it starts in Germany, it's a gathering of different princes or vampire knightly orders, and generally some arguments about what's going on. And again, courtly intrigue, and again, not knowing who to trust and having to make some choices on that. I think at some point my character must have put himself before the vampire lord who was in charge of it all, and went, and read him his fortunes or something crazy. Again, like I say, it's quite interesting that I'm going back trying to remember this. This is all in these write-ups, story write-ups on this blog. So people that are interested in this, again, if they go to the link we'll put in the show notes, they can actually read the stories as they've been written up as actual stories, and then if they want to run them, they can grab the module and run it properly. The Hungary part, why did they go to Hungary? I'm trying to remember. Why the hell did they go to Hungary? I think our characters went back to Hungary via the King Bodor Toth that appears in the Fiendish Winter, because Hungary is quite close to, it's the Dalmatian coast, and thus near to Venice and everything. The Jerusalem part, again, was a bit of nighttime jousting, and again, some political intrigue and stuff. My memory's a bit flaky on it, but again, I think it was quite good, and was a good way of getting your characters all the way back to the East again.
Yeah, well, basically the idea is it's about the movement of the Teutonic knights, those knights who fought literally under the Black Cross rather than the normal Red Cross that you see on Crusaders, and that's to do with the kind of cleansing of what they call the pagan lands in the East, Hungary, those kind of areas, and basically bringing Christianity to Shimsy lands.
Yeah,
and that's a good kind of analogy of what basically the group's there to do, and they're basically caught up in the Ventru, basically wanting to expand. The whole thing where they go into Jerusalem again is because Jerusalem is for Vampires of the Dark Ages. For those you don't know, it's its own setting book. Quite a lot of these stories are tying you back into settings books. Normally, either Jerusalem or Constantinople by Night, which are both great. You should pick up either one of those or both, because they're both great. Now, again, as I said before, lots of these books are pointing towards other books. Some of the modules, in my opinion, I think you really need these other books to back them up. Now, if you want to play the Transylvania Chronicles, I really think you need to pick up Transylvania by Night to flesh that out. Now, I'm not advocating that you go out and spend loads and loads of money and get these books, come back to me and say, hey, my group didn't use this, my group didn't use that. This is the kind of stuff that you can pick up on PDF fairly cheaply and skim it for what you want to use, especially for Transylvania by Night and the Transylvania Chronicles, because those, like the Giovanni Chronicles, are quite epic, that you have to do a lot of work in between yourself to flesh out the mere bare bones of an idea. And lots of these books, especially early World of Darkness books, you need to expand upon it yourself. Now, I know, Chris, that you've got your own Venice setting out at the minute. Have you ever had any experience in the old World of Darkness, basically fleshing out a system, or in the new World of Darkness fleshing out a system that you've used supplements to give you inspiration for?
Yes. I mean, everything I've written in my own Venice setting book really couldn't have been done without relying on a large amount of everything from which book is it? Lords of Summer for Changeling the Lost, because obviously it has all about how courts work, and and other courts that exist in the setting, and that all helped me come up with the basis for the Court of Carnival, which is pretty much unique to Venice. And I think for my Manchester setting, a lot of that relies on my use of the Mythologies book for Vampire the Requiem. So that includes the Cult of Mithras, which we recently rewrote the rules for in Forgotten Lore, whichever number, I think number 1 or number 2.
No, I think that's Forgotten Lore number 2, mate. Yep.
Yeah, and so I think all these modules, I mean, there's a lot there to use, but also there's a lot of room to pad out, because a lot of these stories, a lot of the stories for the modules, there are like tens and tens of years between, and so you don't have to run them all back to back. You can really, insert extra stories, or if you get tired of the characters seemingly traveling around a lot, is just go, right, you're in this single city for now while your characters get more money to do what they want to do. Like I said, like if you really wanted to get more into about Venice, you could easily do that. There's so much plot there to do. With the Doges, or you could go to Rome. I mean, you only got to have a look at how cool Rome would have been at the time. I mean, Assassin's Creed 2 Brotherhood is set is set later than the Fourth Crusade, because you're looking at Renaissance times, so you're looking at 1400s. But it really gives you a sense of what the city could have been like. The architecture may be not as advanced, but it gives you an idea of the scale of what things would have been there, like the Colosseum would have still been there, and various old ancient temples would have been there from Roman times. So, and that means then you could easily go along and say take Requiem for Rome, and use the city map for that, and what information there is of Rome. Of the temples, and just to give you ideas of like what Rome would be for your Dark Ages game, for obviously Vampire the Dark Ages. So there's lots of stuff you can pad out and base stuff off.
Yeah, definitely. Like one idea that I was thinking about again this week is looking at May's Sorcerer's Crusade. Now, I'm glad you brought up Assassin's Creed, because they're both set in the kind of Renaissance period, aren't they?
Yeah.
At the end of the Dark Ages, almost the re-enlightenment of the West to cultural things that, like say, the Muslim world has been exposed to for hundreds of years. But anyway, using things like, say, May's Sorcerer's Crusade to continue your Vampire the Dark Ages game into a new era by basically taking all the mage stuff and having a look at it and say, oh, okay, well, I can see how their influence in science and humanity has then pushed the church perhaps to a back footing to allow science to come, and that then the conflict between, instead of paganism, science. And you could set seeds of that, where your players, again, buying into that idea of coming to things from 20th century ideas, or, like you said, that interesting idea for an Assamite that's a chemist, or an alchemy kind of fellow, setting the stage for this new kind of reimagining of things. And one thing that we did in the Dark Ages campaign that I played in for a long time was a lot of blue booking.
Yeah.
Where, basically taking downtime and say, okay, then between this adventure and this adventure is 50 years. What are you doing? I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. I'm going to cultivate my herd. I'm going to cultivate my contacts in the church. I'm going to do this. Allowing your storyteller to go away for a while and say, okay, Chris, you said you wanted to cultivate your contacts in the church. Here's this mini kind of opening sequence to the next story that I'm going to do that fleshes that out for you, and puts a bit of work in it for you, and then gives you a reward that's almost instantaneous. Like, you could take contacts too and have them as being clergy. That leads into an interesting, say, philosophical debate that then takes over, say, a cult, or perverting some kind of burgeoning church, like, say, like you were talking about before, about the rise of Protestantism.
Yeah, Protestants, yeah.
Basically, your character could be involved in the rise of that, and influencing that from a scientific point of view, or from an ecclesiastic point of view, that ties into these monumental events that we talked about in the chronicle design, that's trying to get your group involved in great events but you can use history as a springboard to get your characters buying into things like great imaginative or evocative ideas, things like the Black Death,
Yeah,
the
I mean,
plague.
the plagues hit like again, like obviously I take the Venice book because I researched the damn out of that to write that, but like the plague during those time hit so often, and totally killed a quarter to a third of the population of major cities. And that would have a knock-on effect to the vampires, and you could really take the idea like out of Vampire the Requiem, the Morbus bloodline. They're a vampire bloodline that can manipulate disease and illness and can only feed on people like that. You can really take that idea and put it into Masquerade quite happily, and see how the plague eras were for like vampires. Could you imagine a vampire that got hold of that was diseased, and how do you deal with it? Do you kill them on sight, or do you try and cure them, or is the plague a curse by God or something? Another thing I was going to say was the other thing that happens within the Renaissance is the starting of an actual banking system, and so you can really look at the birth of kind of like you're looking at the birth maybe of kind of like the modern form of like the Ventru and even say the Giovanni, with being involved in these new but will go on to be important socio-political groups. Like Venice had the first gyro bank, and you've also got the printing press.
Definitely, but those are all things that the group know are worth investing in because they come from a 20th century mindset. Buying into that, there is in character and out of character information, and sometimes there's a blur between those two things. Let's face it. But playing into the hands of that is a great idea. I couldn't agree more. Like you say, having somebody that's say a Toreador that's responsible for the birth of the printing press, and then say the Brujar then getting their hands on it and then changing it. That leads to their own downfall then in say like France. And with the whole kind of French Revolution. But those are the kind of things that we're talking about here in these Dark Ages game. Don't you feel that if you're going to tell these stories, they tend to be quite sweeping, epic kind of things, because that's the kind of nature or the way that the game comes across, even in these modules that we've talked about, especially like the Transylvania Chronicles. Have you had much experience with those?
I've not played that series, no.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a real shame. People can pick it up at Dry Throw RPG. I won't elaborate too much if Chris doesn't know too much.
You can tell me what you want, because I mean I'm open to knowing about it.
In my mind, it's a great alternative for people that've got players in their group that turn to you and say, well, I've done the Giovanni Chronicles. What else are you going to throw at me? Okay, then let's have a look at something else. Let's have a look at the Transylvania Chronicles. Let's have a look at running things from a different world point of view and from a different kind of perspective, because Transylvania at the time is the rise of things like the Gargoyles, the Tremere, the war between the Tremere and the Shimizi. Now, that gets developed upon in Dark Ages Vampire into being the Omen War that's running before the War of the Princes. And that's something that's also in Vampire the Dark Ages, that the usurpers basically burst onto the scene in Vienna, I think. Now, that's smack in the heart of Shimizi country, and they're pretty cheesed off. Now, at the time, they're normally feuding with the Nosferatu and the Gangrel of the area. And for once, they get to basically put aside their differences, because the Shimizi the Tremere start using bits and pieces of all of those three clans to create things like gargoyles. And a change of a political scene where you could say, okay, then you all say Shimizi brood, or affiliates of the Shimizi in this area. Now, remember that other clans exist in these voivode states as well. It's not just entirely Shimizi. There are other clans out there that are willing to work under the fiends, or turn a blind eye to their brutality. Now, all these kind of things allow you to build upon this idea that there's something else going on in the world in an area that we can buy into the idea of. Like Dracula is caught up in the whole of this kind of Transylvania Chronicles. So Vlad Tepes, this kind of a historical figure. It's a great sweeping chronicle. Okay, it's in it's in 4 books, and you really need Transylvania by Night to kind of flesh it out a bit. But you can pick up all of those on PDF and fairly cheaply, and run something that's quite alternative than the normal kind of Giovanni Chronicles. Like you get a lot of people who say that they've played Giovanni Chronicles. Now, Adrian's big campaign that he talked about in the first few episodes of this Darkling was all set in the Giovanni Chronicles, spanning to the modern nights. But you could do the same thing for players who've gone through that once, but tell it from a different point of view to still allow them to buy into that sweeping storyline. Now, have you done anything like that? Something that led you to the modern nights, or was your Dark Ages thing something that rose and fell in the Dark Ages?
I think that basically stayed as a Dark Ages game. We didn't really see how that went on into modern nights. Yeah, there's nothing more I can really say on that. I mean, I think what was I going to say then? I think when you say about sweeping stories, I think that comes across because also it's quite easy in the Dark Ages setting for your vampires to be quite powerful, because it's easy to wield so much power over mortals, and also because they can feasibly be quite low generation, and you can really play these kind of quite epic. Or, epic, when I say epic, they're either going to be epic characters or they're going to be tragically epic characters as they play through the downfall of their clan or bloodline. And I think Dark Ages Vampire the Dark Ages and the books there really help you, can help you play those type of stories if you want, but equally, many of the books, because they detail particular cities and so forth, you can really, if you want to play a much more tightly focused game on a particular city and a particular court, and your characters not be monumental figures in the rise and fall of different groups.
Okay, we've spoken quite at length about quite kind of metaphysical kind of stuff, about the kind of ideas behind things, but one of the other things I wanted to talk about is ways that you can actually put this into play. Now, Adrian, in our kind of show notes before he had to take a step back, was talking about a time that he passed around for a particular kind of scene, a vial of vinegar that he encouraged his players to smell, to get the sense of the smell of the place that they were in, as a use of a storytelling technique. Now, that's something that I wanted to talk about for the Dark Ages, the use of things like, and I know things are a bit cliche, but things like candles, or playing by a slightly darker light to buy into this idea that this is not the age of the fluorescent bulb.
Isn't playing by a slightly darker light a standard way of playing all World Darkness games?
Yeah, but okay, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Perhaps buying some candles or some tea lights, and basically setting them up around your table instead of playing by, I don't know, ultraviolet or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, candles are pretty much standard to our to playing role play in general, but it worked really well for Dark Ages. So yeah, darker lighting and candles really add to it. I mean, you can achieve quite a lot. As you said, he passed around vinegar. So again, if you really wanted to go the whole hog with it, I mean, let's think, what kinds of things could you do? I mean, there's always you could get if you get hold of various spices, and mulled wine can help in that sense. It can give quite a right kind of feeling. Obviously, depending upon how fancy you want to be, there's always the classic scented candles if the game is set in a particular place. If there's something that kind of works for that, I guess you could do that. Other things to do to really set the scene. Well, before we get onto music, because that's a whole big area. Other things I did was so my character had his own journal. So, okay, my Malkavian, his madness, his main flaw was that he was an obsessive compulsive, and he had to write his journal entry before the sun rose each night, or else he would be frantic and then be quite mad the following night. And I took to doing an in-character journal whenever I could, like when there was a down moment, writing his ideas down, or kind of like I know shit about music, but I wrote some stuff that looked like his own sheet music, and my storyteller looked at it and went, "That is quite the most insane amount of writing I've ever seen." Like I literally, like he could read some of it and not read other bits of it, and even I after a while couldn't read it because it was just like complete madness. But it really did help to get the idea of the character's like mindset and his view on different people, or on his philosophy of his unlife. So obviously that can really help. Is like physical items like that, even maps of if you can print off, and I know it's a typical tea stain thing, but like a map of the area at that time can be really quite informative when you realise that certain cities just didn't exist then, or how different the borders were. Yeah. Any other things that you've used? I mean, obviously you could go whole hog and dress up.
Yeah, well, definitely. That's when you perhaps start looking at perhaps running a LARP rather than a tabletop thing. But one thing that we did a couple of times for both a kind of a Henyokai kind of campaign and the Dark Ages thing is put on some different food. And we had like what was basically a medieval evening meal for like a peasant, which is some very kind of grainy kind of things, some fruit, some cheese, and some other bits and pieces. That was like a medieval kind of thing instead of our normal pizza and crisps.
Yeah.
To kind of get us into that kind of idea. Again, that's something that kind of worked, I thought, especially for the kind of Far Eastern thing, because it really set the mood for the rest of the evening. But also, it kind of got you into this idea that, like peasants weren't eating a lot, and that your normal, like, you eat meat with every meal because that's what we do. No, they didn't eat meat all the time. And if you ate a lot of meat, it's because you were fairly rich. And things like, religious belief that you eat fish on Friday is a big deal as well.
Yeah.
To kind of get your idea into things like customs. Now,
cheese would be good. You'll get across if your game was set in France at the time. It'd be awesome.
No isms, mate. Okay, so now you wanted to speak a bit about music, because that's one of the big things that you were talking about when we were talking in the emails in the beginning of the week.
Yeah.
What's your
Okay. From what I've said on any other Dark Days, it's like music to me has always been a big thing in my own games, and it's always been good when I've when I originally got into that new roleplay group and thus into playing Vampire the Dark Ages, was like, oh right, you do playlists too, and it's like, good, we're all on the same kind of like playing field with this. Like, music is critical to having like a really good gaming experience. So, and the music really covers quite a diverse range. I mean, when you've got a bunch of alternative goth type role players, they're going to listen to, you're going to be listening to a lot of music that just isn't in the mainstream, and there's a lot of good stuff that works for Dark Ages or for Renaissance, or to really give that feel. You want to get away from the electronics, and some of the stuff I've got in some playlists that I've got on Spotify, so again I'll link those. So I would say, even though it's for a different time period, like, it's music for a game that's set in the Renaissance, but I think you can. But some of the music is actually for the first game in the series. So the Assassin's Creed series of games. Assassin's Creed 1 is set during the Crusades. Assassin's Creed 2 is set during the Renaissance. The scores for all the games of Assassin's Creed 2, Brotherhood, and Revelations are perfect. Essentially because the instruments that are used to create music didn't really change much between the Crusading period and the Renaissance, really. So it gives the right feel. So you can find these by Just Kid. You can look them up on Spotify or Last.fm. Revelations, the soundtrack for Assassin's Creed Revelations is really good because, of course, that game is set in Constantinople, so you get really a lot more of that Eastern vibe. Right, I'm trying to look through the rest of the playlist here. If I look at my Changeling the Lost soundtrack, where I find it, that's my Vampire the Requiem one. Changeling the Lost Venice. I would suggest bands like Arcana, who do some very good kind of classic, alternative gothic, dark music that fits that kind of theme. Another band called Hecate are quite good. They have some really good, really mad songs. Let's see, who else is on this list? And also there's a collection of music called, I think it's called The Last Rites. Again, I'll try and find the link to it or the name of it and put it in the show notes. But again, that collects a lot of these kind of like ambient or how can you say, medieval gothic bands that do music of that style, and they make use of like instruments like the hurdy-gurdy. What else have I got on my Iron Kingdom soundtrack that might be of use? Obviously, if you're going to do something that's set in the Renaissance, I know a bit later, but obviously you can't go wrong with a bit of Vivaldi. But, there's a lot you can do to just choose music that has the right feel to it. The Prince of Persia Sands of Time film, the soundtrack to that's really great. And again, if you want to get more of an Eastern, Middle Eastern Persian feel to the soundtrack, so that works quite well. What other bands would you suggest or soundtracks? Oh, Kingdom of Heaven. Can't forget Kingdom of Heaven. That works really well.
Yeah, definitely. You took the words literally right out of my mouth there. These are soundtracks and bits and pieces that I was going to draw on, perhaps not from the kind of goth EBM kind of world that I know that that's the kind of music I listen to as well. Mm-hmm. But I realise for a lot of people, you're not going to want to listen to it because it's not your cup of tea. But things like film soundtracks, like you say, Kingdom of Heaven, In the Name of the Rose, and also if you know the movie The Pit and the Pendulum, and things like Hammer horror kind of things that are set in this era that are, like you say, slightly out of era, but are still using the same kind of instruments, things like mandolins instead of guitars, things like harpsichords, those kind of things that allow you to listen with that ear that you could probably put like a lot of early perhaps Tudor music in the Dark Ages, and it wouldn't make much difference to a modern ear. Especially like if it speaks to you. That's the big thing that I wanted to say about music is sometimes you just got to go with the flow. That if it's a piece of music that really sits with you, that's right, that perhaps allows you to get across what you want to do, and it doesn't quite fit in with this. Well, certain movies nowadays make use of songs that are out of time, so to speak. Like if you've ever seen the movie Sucker Punch.
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch of kind of action sequences to that, to remixes of songs that are perhaps not the images that you're seeing. Like there's a big fight at the beginning that's set to Bjork's Army of Me, that's against kind of giant Japanese kind of samurai things. Now, your first kind of thought would be to perhaps play something that's Oriental in theme, but something like Army of Me, that's to a modern ear quite driving, lends itself well to that scene. So there's not to say that you needn't just pick up things that are like Gregorian chants and things like this. They have their place.
They have their place.
Yeah. If they're used right, that's great. But there's nothing wrong with using a modern song like perhaps even some Led Zeppelin or something like that. Something that's a bit more orchestral, but rocky. Or do you understand what I mean? And not just basically tie yourself to a certain kind of music.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I'm trying to think like. So I mean, like, just to give an example, so it's a different game, but like, so Iron Kingdoms is which we did in the Darkling. The setting is for that is kind of like is very much meant to be a reflection of like just before like the Industrial Revolution, and has a very how can you say Napoleonic feel to it. So the soundtrack I've kind of thrown together for that consists of like Assassin's Creed soundtracks, obviously, because running over roofs is really fun, and I'm going to let people do that in a roleplay game. But also stuff from like the Batman Arkham City soundtrack, because that video game score has got very gothic tones to it, or Pirates of the Caribbean soundtracks, because I just can't get enough of Hans Zimmer. And the Dark Knight Rises, and actually anything to do with the Nolan versus Batman series, all those scores are awesome and have kind of that, because they use quite a lot of drums and pounding like that, give kind of the right high notes and drama without being too modern. I guess you could even use the Inception soundtrack to a Dark Ages game. Yeah. Hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, something went wrong there. Anyway.
Okay. This is again, like I said, choosing music that speaks to you. Now, one thing that I've done in my current game is tie all the kind of elders that really kind of are involved in the kind of major plot into remixes of one song. In the current Sabbath thing that I'm going to be running for my group, the metamorphosis of Vorsheza, I'm going to be tying, like I said, into the Wumpcut song. Now, I'm sure Chris knows this, but Wumpcut do a lot of remixes of their songs, normally by other bands, which gives them a quite different feel to each one of their songs, but it's still essentially the same. Now, I'm going to tap into this idea that it's the same character that they're dealing with, but then the remixes denote a change in perhaps the political structure, the change in the story, the change in perception of things, that then using music to reinforce that. What I was also going to do is all this brood, I was also going to use different remixes as well. So when his music changes, their music changes, to denote that it's like a change of mood in the kind of Shimizu camp. That is a great way for your players to buy into the idea that something's different without coming out and saying that something's different. Because most people's ears are quite attuned to music and can sense that it's still the same song but slightly different. And when you start describing how your NPCs are going to act and stuff like that, it can allow you to show that change, especially for like clans like the Shimizu, or to show a change in, like I said, political change, that you have, say, a weak version of a song or a mild version of a song, and then a bigger or a more brazen version of a song. That somebody who was low down in power that then takes power. You have a brazen version of their song that when they do take power, it's the same song but much bigger, much brighter, like their character is taking much more of a kind of a center stage in your story. So the song then backs that up.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I wanted to tap into with this use of music. And things like tying scenes together by using the same kind of music. Like, I know it's perhaps a bit cliched again, but if you look at, say, the Star Wars movies, you only need to hear a kind of, especially in the episode 4, 5, and 6, a little kind of couple of bars of the Imperial March,
Mm-hmm.
Darth Vader's music, and you know it's about Darth Vader, or the dark side, or something dark has gone on, that resonates through that movie, that once you hear it and you look for it, you can see how many times they use the Imperial March, that when something dark is happening, or when especially like the outro music to the Empire Strikes Back, that's kind of all kind of tied into it, that your group then picks up on that this is to do with this character in a very subtle way, and then leads them, perhaps by the nose, perhaps without laying too many clues on the floor. They can still get the sense of, this is this guy because his music's playing within reason, but not so cliched as that.
Yeah. I tend to not queue up music at particular times in my game. I generally have a 3-hour soundtrack that's split into 3 sections, because generally I guess that my game will undulate in tone, and I just hope the soundtrack kind of queues up at the right moment. But I mean, you can queue up, and it's quite easy to queue up music these days. It's not like you have to mess around with, I've got to put another CD in or something, or change the tape over. We actually have I'll just hit that track on Spotify, and boom, you've got it. Yeah.
Exactly. Like for my current Vampire the Masquerade setting, there's a song by a group called Nachtmare called Firefly. It's got that long kind of air raid siren, and that's to do with a group of anarchs. Every time they turn up, I play that song. I make sure I play that song to the point now that as soon as that kind of siren starts playing, my group is just like, we're going for guns. We're using our powers. Where are they? But it sets the scene before you even get there.
I think Sam. I think I'll have to confirm with her now. Sam, did you give your vampire character Did you pick out a song track that was iconic of him? Yeah. I can't quite remember. You had a full soundtrack for a character, yeah. It was brilliant. But yeah, I mean, even players can do it, and again, that really adds to
exactly
investment in the game.
I mean, if your player comes to you and says, I really want to kill the Prince of the City, and I want to do it to this music.
Yeah.
Hey, if they want to tell you what they want to do, in my opinion, as a storyteller, let your players do exactly what they want to do, but take them there in an interesting way, in the same way that, like in the old Twilight Zone kind of episodes, the devil will turn up and say, you can have what you want. You ask for it, he gives it you, but in a way that you weren't expecting. That makes it so like, you killed the prince because the prince turned out to be a Barley agent, and all his Barley mates are going to turn up and kill everyone, but you've killed him too late. You do it to your piece of music, and you got exactly what you wanted, but how we got there isn't exactly what you wanted, as an interesting narrative for both of you.
Okay. Right. Have we got anything more we need to talk about there, Steve? I'm just looking at the show notes.
I just say that if anybody thinks we've missed anything that they've used in their own chronicles that has worked out quite well to set the scene for being a Dark Ages, be it a piece of music, a prop, whatever, I'd love to hear about it. And if they'd like to come over to our new Google Plus community page, which I believe has gone up just this week, isn't it, Chris?
Oh yeah, Google has been we've been hammering at that place. So Google Plus community is already more active than the Facebook page we had, and already more active than our Posterous group. The Posterous blog we'll still be using to blog, because obviously it's just easier for dissemination, but the community is going to be the main place to get hold of us and to chat about things. So we've got some members on there, but obviously more is better. And guess what? We actually have members who are, shock horror, I think they're actually writers as well. So, you can obviously put questions forward there and even direct them at particular writers who are already members of the group. So yeah, that's the best place to get hold of us. Any other questions, or if they want to email us, they can of course email us at darkerdaysradio@gmail.com. Of course we have a Facebook page still, and we have a Twitter, which we just about use. But I would seriously say everyone just goes to the Google Plus community. For simplicity, it means we don't need to check too many places. And is there anything else we need to say, Steve? Or is that all the contact details? Obviously,
I'd only just like to...
Yeah, go for it.
I'd just like to add to that if I've plugged a few modules in this with Chris tonight, that if you do decide to go to Drive-Thru RPG and download some of these books or get them print on demand, which I believe quite a few of them becoming available now, you remember good old Darker Days Radio and use our
affiliate
code
ID.
that gives us,
Yeah,
which I'm sure Chris can chuck up in the show notes, so we get a bit of a kickback. So you get something out of us telling about something quite cool.
Yeah, I mean, I will do that. So a lot of these things I'll link up on the show notes, like the direct links to the supplements, and put in the affiliate ID, because we're actually getting a bit of credit through Drive-Thru RPG, which means we can buy some prizes. Also, we also have to again thank Adrian for all his previous work on this series and his work on Forgotten Laws. He will not be forgotten and will be sincerely missed.
No, definitely not. He's a man of erudition and a great person has taken a step back from the community. I wish him well with his PhD and hope that everything works out, that he's going to come back renewed and invigorated and ready to flood us with some more of his great insights into the games. You'll be missed, man. And
of course, we're going to, I guess, the next one in this series, which I guess is maybe the last in the short term, because obviously there's only so much content we can cover, and while we try and get some more ideas and stuff. What are we going to be looking at, Steve, on the next Dark Ages one?
We're going to be looking at how you can port the Dark Ages setting over into your Requiem game. Now, this is an idea that Chris has come to that I'm really buying into. I've picked up the Inviticus and the Lankia Sanctum books after he posted some information up on Google Docs. That's literally like taking this game setting and using it in your Requiem setting. And hey, why not? Chris is a well-renowned expert in the New World of Darkness, and I'm looking forward to sharing some insights into this interesting take on the New World of Darkness Requiem game.
Yeah, I think basically we'll go through. I think we'll go through all the important points that are within the Requiem setting, which are mentioned in relation to this period of time, and basically just try and think as hard as we can about, that bit could be supported if you use that particular Dark Ages book, and just take that information and it would help you pad out that part in the Requiem setting. So it should be really interesting. I mean, it should be good fun and good to look at, and you never know, that might lead to White Wolf, on its path forward, going, hey, we should do this for Requiem. I mean, if they do that, they need to give us something in return. You heard us, Richard Thomas. We're out for you. And yeah, I think
I'm happy with my name in the books. I'm just happy with my name in the books when I kickstart. That's enough for me.
Yeah.
Well, I think that wraps up the show for this evening, Chris. I'd like to just say thanks very much for coming on board and sharing some of your insights into your storytelling in the Dark Ages. I'm Verghast, otherwise known as Steve, and I'm signing off.
And this is Chris signing off, and it's been a pleasure to go through all this with you, Steve. So, goodbye.